You asked me what it's like, and I'll tell you, though the telling changes nothing and helps no one, and serves only to put words to experiences that language was never meant to contain. I served 17 years aboard the Righteous Deliverance, a dictator-class cruiser in the battle fleet Tempestus, and when I say served I mean I survived, which is not the same thing at all. My name, what I was called before the Navy recoded me as rating tertiary 4476 Gamma Null, doesn't matter anymore. Names are luxuries reserved for officers and the dead. I was neither, though I spent every day of those 17 years moving steadily from the first category toward the second. The smell hits you first when you board a warship. Not immediately, not in the docking bay where visiting dignitaries and fresh conscripts arrive, where they've installed atmosphere processors that create an artificial breeze smelling faintly of incense and machine oil. No, the real smell comes later, when you descend into the crew decks, into the kilometers of corridor and compartment where 40,000 souls live, pressed together in a space designed for efficient warfare rather than human habitation. It's the smell of bodies that haven't been properly clean in months or years, of recycled air that's passed through too many lungs and carries the accumulated exhalation of decades, of latrines that serve hundreds and are cleaned by servitors whose olfactory sensors long ago burned out, of chemical lubricants and coolant leaks, and the sweet, sick odor of flesh wounds healing badly in the bacterial soup of shared quarters. After a week, you stop noticing it consciously. After a month, it's soaked into your skin, your hair, your clothing. After a year, you smell like the ship, and you'll carry that smell for the rest of your life, however long or short that might be. I came aboard at conscription age, 18 standard years, swept up in the tithe from a hive world whose name I no longer remember. They took 3,000 of us from the mid-hive manufactorums, examined us in assembly line medical bays, sorted us by capability and desperation. The smart ones, the ones with education or technical aptitude, became junior technicians or gunnery calculators. The strong ones became armsmen or loading crews. The rest, those of us who were merely adequate, neither brilliant nor physically exceptional, became ratings, the general labor pool that kept a warship functioning through sheer human effort multiplied by overwhelming numbers. They shaved our heads, issued us grey utility coveralls that would be our only clothing for our entire service, tattooed our new designations on our left forearms in black ink that never quite healed properly, leaving the numbers raised and itchy. Then they marched us through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, past gun decks and magazine storage and crew quarters, down into the belly of the ship, where we would spend the rest of our lives maintaining the systems that kept 40,000 people breathing, eating, and capable of unleashing the Emperor's wrath on his enemies. My assignment was Environmental Subsection Theta 7, which meant I was responsible for maintaining atmospheric processors, waste recyclers, and water reclamation systems across 3 decks in the aft starboard quarter. The section chief was a woman named Korvac, who'd been aboard for 32 years and had the skeletal appearance of someone whose body had been slowly consumed by the ship itself. She explained my duties in a flat, affectless voice while we stood in a chamber filled with massive cylindrical tanks connected by pipes as thick as my torso. The air here was warm, humid, smelling of chemicals and something organic that I didn't want to identify. The tanks hummed with internal processing, their surfaces slick with condensation that dripped steadily onto the deck plates with a rhythm that would become the metronome of my existence. "You'll check pressure readings every 4 hours, Korvac said, gesturing to a row of analog gauges mounted on the nearest tank. "If anything drops below the green zone, you report it immediately. You'll clean the filter screens twice per shift, you'll check for leaks constantly, you'll perform ritual maintenance every 6 days according to the procedures in this manual." She handed me a battered book, its pages brown with age and moisture, the Gothic text barely legible. "If something breaks and you can't fix it, you report it. If something breaks and you think you might be able to fix it, you report it first, then attempt repairs only if authorized. If you fail to report a malfunction and it causes system failure, you'll be flogged. If you cause a system failure through negligence, you'll be executed. If you damage a system through unauthorized repair attempts, you'll be executed. If you do your job adequately for your entire service term, you might survive to retirement age, at which point the administratum will calculate whether your pension costs more than your continued service value, and you'll either be retained indefinitely or mustered out to die poor on whatever world we happen to be near. Do you understand? I understood. The logic was simple. You were a component in a vast machine, valuable only insofar as you performed your function. The moment you failed, you became waste material to be processed and recycled. The Imperium didn't believe in second chances or rehabilitation. You worked until you couldn't, and then you were discarded. This was mercy. This was the Emperor's love made manifest through brutal efficiency. My quarters were a bunk in a compartment that held 60 people, stacked 3 high with barely enough space between levels to roll over. My assigned space was middle rack, which meant I avoided the smell of feet from above and the proximity to the deck from below, where puddles formed when the atmospheric processors couldn't keep pace with condensation. I had a locker the size of a small crate, where I could store personal effects if I'd had any. Most people kept prayer beads, letters from home that they'd read until the paper dissolved, small icons or charms. I kept the maintenance manual Korvac had given me, studying it during the rare off-shift hours when I wasn't too exhausted to focus. The routine established itself with crushing inevitability. Wake at 0600 ship time to the blare of alarm klaxons. 30 minutes to use the communal latrines' metal troughs with water flowing through them, no privacy, no dignity, and choke down a meal bar made from recycled protein that tasted of metal and sadness. By 0630, you were at your duty station, and you remained there for 12 hours straight except for 2 15-minute breaks. The work was simultaneously monotonous and demanding. Checking gauges required attention because the difference between acceptable pressure and dangerous pressure was sometimes a single indicator width. Cleaning filter screens meant removing panels, extracting screens clogged with particulate matter. I tried not to examine too closely, scrubbing them with caustic chemicals that left my hands raw, and reinstalling everything in precise order. Ritual maintenance involved reciting prayers to the machine spirits while performing tasks that seemed arbitrary, touching certain pipes in certain sequences, anointing junction boxes with sacred oils, making the sign of the Aquila before engaging or disengaging any major system. I learned quickly that the machine spirits were real, or at least that treating them as real produced better outcomes than assuming the machines were merely mechanical. A recalcitrant pump would suddenly engage after proper prayer. A valve that seemed seized would open smoothly if you approached it with appropriate reverence. The tech priests insisted this was the Omnissiah's blessing flowing through properly maintained systems, and perhaps they were right. Or perhaps the equipment was so old, so worn, so far beyond its designed operational lifespan that it required psychological comfort to convince it to continue functioning. Either way, I learned to pray sincerely and often. The ship's routine became my routine. Wake, work, eat, work, sleep. Sometimes the cycle was interrupted by battle stations, when enemy contacts appeared on the long-range augers and the entire vessel transformed from a city into a weapon. During battle stations, you remained at your duty post no matter what, maintaining your systems while the ship shuddered with weapons fire and the sound of impacts transmitted through the hull like the tolling of massive bells. My first combat engagement was against orc pirates, and I stood at my gauges watching pressure fluctuations while somewhere far above, lance batteries and macro cannons were hurling destruction into the void. We took hits. The deck tilted. The lights failed and emergency lumens cast everything in red. Someone in my section was screaming Korvac, I realized, pinned beneath a pipe that had torn free from its moorings. I helped pull her out, her leg bent at an angle that made my stomach clench, and then I returned to my gauges because that was my duty, and she was being dragged away by Medicae servitors, and there was nothing else I could do. She came back 3 weeks later with a crude augmetic leg that clicked when she walked. She never mentioned the incident, neither did I. This was how the Navy worked. You did your duty, you survived or you didn't, and either way the ship continued its mission. Sentimentality was a luxury that served no function. Emotional attachment was a weakness that the void would exploit. You learned to care about systems and procedures rather than people, because people died regularly and systems, if properly maintained, endured. The months blurred into years, each one marked not by calendars, but by the gradual accumulation of small changes. My hands developed calluses on top of calluses, the skin thick and insensitive to the chemicals I worked with daily. My back began to ache from the constant stooping and crawling through maintenance tunnels. My hearing degraded from the constant machinery noise until I had to read lips as much as listen during conversations. I developed a chronic cough from the atmosphere, a wet rattle that never quite went away. Everyone had it. We called it ship lung. And it marked you as Navy even on shore leave, those rare occasions when we docked at civilized worlds and were granted a few hours to walk under open sky and remember what weather felt like. But shore leave was rare, maybe twice a year if we were fortunate, and brief. Most of our existence was the ship, and the ship was eternal. The righteous deliverance had been in service for 4,000 years, according to the plaques in the chapel, though how much of the original vessel remained was debatable. Ships were rebuilt constantly, sections replaced when damaged, systems upgraded when technology permitted, until the vessel was less a single object than a continuous tradition, a name and a mission carried forward by countless iterations of steel and void shielding. I found a strange comfort in that continuity. I might die, would almost certainly die aboard this vessel, but the ship would continue. And in some sense my service would continue with it, my small contributions to its maintenance becoming part of the accumulated experience that kept it functional. The crew changed too. People died combat, accidents, illness, executions for various infractions. New conscripts arrived, wide-eyed and terrified, and I would watch them go through the same process I had, the gradual erosion of individuality, until they became indistinguishable components of the ship's function. I trained several of them, teaching the gauge reading and filter cleaning and ritual maintenance that Korvac had taught me. She eventually died, a sudden cerebral hemorrhage while on duty, and I inherited her position as section chief. The promotion came with no increase in pay, no improvement in quarters, only additional responsibility and the knowledge that I was now accountable for the section's performance in a way that could result in punishment if standards slipped. The smell had changed for me by then. I no longer noticed the baseline stench of human habitation, but I developed the ability to detect subtle variations that indicated problems. A sharp chemical tang meant a coolant leak. A sweet organic note meant biological waste was backing up somewhere. The absence of the normal machinery smell meant something had stopped running. I would walk my sections like a medicae reading symptoms, identifying problems by scent before the gauges registered them. This was expertise, the accumulated knowledge of years spent in intimate proximity with systems whose moods and quirks I'd learned to interpret. I was good at my job, which meant I survived, which meant I continued doing my job, an endless cycle of competence and persistence. I was 28 when the Gellar Field failed. We were in transit through the warp, that impossible realm of nightmares and unreality that the Imperium used for faster-than-light travel because the alternative was generations-long voyages between stars. The Gellar Field was supposed to protect us, creating a bubble of real space around the ship while we traveled through the Imperium. But technology fails. Even blessed, maintained, prayed over technology fails eventually. I was checking gauges in subsection Theta 7 Tertiary, a deep compartment 3 decks below my usual station, when the field collapsed. I didn't know what had happened at first. The lights didn't flicker, no alarms sounded, but I felt something change, a fundamental wrongness in the air, as if the space around me had suddenly become porous, penetrable by things that shouldn't exist. The smell changed first, not gradually, but instantly, completely. The familiar stench of ship and machinery was gone, replaced by something I can only describe as the scent of distance and angles and colors that sound made when they were falling. My mind tried to process the sensory input and failed, creating a feedback loop of synesthesia that made me dizzy and nauseous. I looked at the gauges and saw the needles moving in ways that violated causality, pointing backward in time, indicating pressures that were somehow both too high and too low simultaneously, displaying readings in languages I didn't know, but could suddenly read perfectly. I heard screaming. Not from any direction I could identify, but from everywhere at once, from inside my own skull, from the future and the past converging on the present. I turned and saw Technician Raal, who'd been working in the same compartment, except he wasn't Raal anymore, or he was Raal, and everything Raal could have been in infinite variations, all occupying the same space, flickering between possibilities faster than my eyes could track. He was young and old and unborn and dead, his face shifting through expressions of joy and terror and emotions that humans didn't have names for. He reached toward me, and his hand had too many fingers, or not enough, or the correct number, but they were located in time rather than space, and when he touched my shoulder, I felt every year of his life simultaneously, his birth, his childhood in an orbital factory, his conscription, his death that hadn't happened yet but was happening now, in this moment, as something from the warp reached through the failed field and plucked him out of existence. He vanished. Not died, not destroyed, simply ceased to have ever been. And I remembered him and didn't remember him simultaneously, held both realities in my mind at once, and the contradiction was agony. The Gellar Field came back online 17 minutes later. I know this because the chronometer on the bulkhead showed the time elapsed, though I have no memory of those 17 minutes except as a series of images and sensations that my mind has since edited into something resembling narrative, because the alternative is madness. When reality reasserted itself, I was lying on the deck, every muscle rigid, my fingernails bloody from clawing at the floor plates. The compartment looked normal. The gauges were reading normal levels. But there were bloodstains on the bulkheads that hadn't been there before, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at, that seemed to contain meanings just beyond comprehension. And Technician Rahl was gone. His locker in the quarters was gone. The duty rosters showed a blank space where his name should have been. Only I remembered him, and even that memory was fragmenting, becoming uncertain. 743 crew members were lost during the field failure. Not killed, lost. Some simply vanished like Rahl. Others were found dead of no apparent cause, their bodies unmarked but their faces locked in expressions of terminal horror. Still others survived but changed, speaking in languages no one recognized, seeing things that weren't there, performing their duties with mechanical precision but responding to questions with statements that made no grammatical sense. The ship's commissars executed the worst cases and confined the rest to observation cells where they could be monitored for signs of corruption. I was interviewed by a tech priest whose name I never learned, his biological face hidden behind a brass mask. He asked me what I'd experienced, and I told him everything except the part about remembering Rahl. I'd learned enough survival instinct to know that remembering things that hadn't happened was exactly the kind of symptom that got you executed. He listened without comment, recording my testimony on a data slate, and then he asked me if I'd been touched by anything from beyond the veil. I showed him my shoulder where Rahl had touched me. The skin there was unmarked but cold, permanently cold, as if the temperature had been locked at the moment of contact. The tech priest performed some scans, muttered prayers, and eventually dismissed me as clean but contaminated, which meant I was allowed to continue serving, but would be monitored for signs of daemonic influence. The ship emerged from the warp 3 weeks later, and we docked at a Navy fortress for repairs and crew replenishment. The tech priests spent months rebuilding the Gellar Field generators, carving blessings into every component, performing exorcisms on systems that had been exposed to the Imperium. 743 new ratings arrived to replace those we'd lost, and the machine of the Navy ground forward, accepting the losses as acceptable, necessary, inevitable. I returned to my routine checking gauges, cleaning filters, performing rituals, but everything was different now. I'd seen behind the veil, seen what lay underneath the Imperium's thin surface, and I could never unknow it. The cold spot on my shoulder spread slowly over the following years. Not visibly, the skin looked normal, but I could feel it, a patch of flesh that registered touch but not temperature, that felt like it belonged to someone else. It grew gradually, maybe a centimeter per year, and I tracked its progress with morbid fascination. By my 35th birthday, it covered my entire left shoulder and was creeping down my arm and across my chest. I wondered if it would eventually consume me entirely, if I would become like Rahl, simultaneously present and absent, and what would happen when the cold finally reached my heart. I'd been promoted twice more by then, now supervising an entire environmental section encompassing 9 subsections and 200 personnel. The responsibility was crushing. Every malfunction was my fault. Every death was my failure. When Rating Julius fell into a waste reclamation tank and drowned in chemical slurry because a safety railing had corroded through, I was flogged for inadequate maintenance oversight. When subsection Theta 9 experienced atmospheric loss that killed 12 people, I was placed under investigation for 3 months while tech priests and administrative officials determined whether negligence or mere misfortune was responsible. They concluded misfortune, but the investigation itself was the punishment. 3 months of constant interrogation and documentation while still maintaining my regular duties and living with the knowledge that a different conclusion would have meant execution. I stopped sleeping properly. The exhaustion was cumulative, an ever-growing debt that could never be repaid. I would lie in my bunk during off-shifts, listening to the ship's nighttime sounds, the breathing of 60 other people in my compartment, the distant machinery, the occasional scream from someone having nightmares they wouldn't remember, and I would think about the cold spreading through my chest and wonder if death would be a relief or just a transition to something worse. The Imperium's theology was unclear on the specifics of the afterlife. The Emperor protected the faithful, we were taught, but protection could mean eternal service in some other form, and I wasn't sure that was better than oblivion. The ship continued its mission. We fought battles against enemies I never saw: Orc warbands, Chaos Raiders, Eldar pirates, Tyrannid scouts. Sometimes we won, sometimes we retreated. Always we survived, though "we" was an increasingly fluid term as the crew complement turned over through attrition and replacement. I calculated once that of the 40,000 souls aboard when I'd first enlisted, fewer than 3,000 remained 17 years later. The rest had been killed, transferred, promoted, or broken down and recycled. The ship was the same ship, but the people had changed completely, multiple times over. We were water flowing through a channel, taking the shape of the vessel that contained us, but never permanent, never essential as individuals. I was 35, looking 50. My body worn down by years of chemical exposure and poor nutrition and constant stress. My hands shook at rest. My vision was deteriorating, despite the corrective lenses the Medicae had issued. The cough that everyone had was worse for me, sometimes producing blood-flecked phlegm that I wiped away and didn't mention because mentioning it would mean medical examination, and medical examination might reveal the spreading cold, and revelation meant investigation, and investigation meant potential execution. Better to work until I collapsed than invite scrutiny. The end came without warning or ceremony. I was checking gauges in subsection Theta 7, the original section where I'd started my service, though all the equipment had been replaced twice over in 17 years when I felt a pressure in my chest, sharp and final. The cold had reached my heart. I knew this with absolute certainty, knew that the thing from the warp that had touched me through Raal's hand had finally consumed enough of me to matter. I sat down carefully on the deck, leaning against a humming tank, and waited to see what would happen. What happened was nothing. No dramatic transformation, no demonic manifestation, no sudden death. Just the pressure, constant and growing, and a sense of displacement, as if I were occupying my body from a slight distance, observing myself from the outside. I reached for the Vox link to call for assistance, but my hand moved sluggishly, and I realized I didn't particularly want assistance. What would they do? The Medicae would examine me, discover the contamination, and have me executed for failure to report it years ago. Better to die here, quietly, another casualty of the infinite ways a warship could kill you. But I didn't die. The pressure stabilized, the displacement remained but became tolerable. I stood up, checked the gauges, all reading normal, and continued my duties. Whatever was happening to me was happening slowly, gradually, at a pace that allowed me to continue functioning. The cold continued its expansion. By the next year, it covered half my torso. By the year after, it had reached my other shoulder and was moving down my right arm. But I could still work, could still maintain the systems, could still survive, which was all the Navy required. I'm 41 now, though I look 60. The cold has spread to cover everything except my head and my left leg. When I touch my own skin, it feels like touching someone else, like wearing a suit of dead flesh. The spreading has slowed. Or perhaps I've simply become accustomed to it, learned to interpret the signals from nerve endings that report sensation without temperature, touch without warmth. I can still do my job. I supervise my sections, train new personnel, maintain the systems that keep the crew breathing and the waste processing and the water recirculating. I am good at this work. I have 17 years of expertise, 17 years of accumulated knowledge about these specific machines in this specific ship. I am valuable to the Imperium, so the Imperium allows me to continue existing. Sometimes I think about Raal, whose name I'm not supposed to remember, who was touched by the warp and erased from reality. I think about the part of him that touched me, the fragment of unreality that's been slowly colonizing my body for 13 years. Is he still alive inside me somehow? Am I becoming him or something else entirely? The questions have no answers, and answers wouldn't matter regardless. I have my duty, I have my function. The ship requires maintenance, and I provide it. This is enough. This has to be enough. You wanted to know what it's really like aboard a warship? This is it. Not the glorious battles shown in propaganda reels, not the heroic sacrifices or the stirring speeches, just the grinding routine of maintenance and survival. The slow erosion of humanity through accumulated trauma and exposure to things humans weren't meant to experience. We serve because we must, because the alternative is death or worse, because the Imperium requires our service and extracts it regardless of cost. We maintain the machines that maintain us, a closed loop of dependence and exploitation that continues until it doesn't, until the ship is destroyed or we are, whichever comes first. The smell of the ship has changed again. I don't know if it's actually different or if my perception has warped along with my body. It smells of distance now, of angles and impossible spaces, of the warp leaking through cracks in reality. Or maybe it's always smelled like this, and I'm only now capable of perceiving it. Maybe every ship that travels through the Imperium carries a permanent stain, a contamination that soaks into bulkheads and flesh alike, and we're all slowly becoming something other than human without realizing it. Maybe that's the real price of interstellar travel, not the risk of accident or attack, but the certainty of transformation, the knowledge that you cannot swim in the warp without the warp swimming in you. I'm writing this during an off shift, sitting in the chapel where they keep the ship's historical records, surrounded by plaques commemorating 4,000 years of service, 40 centuries of crew members who lived and died and were forgotten. My name will join them eventually, another designation number carved into brass, another forgotten component of a machine that outlasts us all. The cold has reached my jaw now. Soon it will cover my head, and I don't know what happens then. Perhaps I'll finally understand what Raal understood in those last moments before he ceased to exist. Perhaps I'll become something that serves the ship more efficiently than a human ever could. Perhaps I'll simply stop thinking, my consciousness finally dissolving into the general background of the ship's machine spirit, my expertise absorbed into the accumulated knowledge that keeps systems functioning. I'm not afraid. Fear requires investment in continued existence, and I stopped investing years ago. I'm curious, perhaps, in a distant academic sense. But mostly I'm tired. 17 years of this life, of this routine, of maintaining systems and training replacements and watching people die. 41 years old and looking at perhaps another 20 or 30 years of service if the cold doesn't finish me and no battle or accident intervenes. The thought is exhausting. But I'll continue. Not because I'm brave or dedicated, but because continuing is what I know how to do. I'm a component in a vast machine, and components function until they fail. You asked what it's really like on a warship. It's this. It's the smell of 40,000 people living in a steel can designed for war. It's the routine of checking gauges and cleaning filters and performing rituals to appease machine spirits that may or may not be real. It's the slow accumulation of damage, physical, psychological, spiritual, until you're more scar tissue than human. It's knowing you're expendable, replaceable, meaningless, except as a unit of labor. It's the warp touching you through failed Gellar Fields and leaving cold spots that spread like cancer. It's surviving not because you're strong or lucky, but because the ship hasn't killed you yet and the Navy still finds you useful. It's everything. The Imperium is brutal, efficient, indifferent to individual suffering, sustained by the grinding labor of countless souls who have no choice but to serve, and it's eternal. When I die, my replacement will already be aboard, learning the gauges and the filters and the rituals. The ship will continue, the Navy will continue, the Imperium will continue, grinding forward on the broken backs of people like me, people whose names don't matter and whose suffering serves a purpose larger than themselves. The Emperor protects, they say. But protection in the Imperium means you're useful enough to keep alive, valued enough to feed and shelter, worth the minimal investment required to maintain you as a functional component. When you cease to be useful, the protection ends, and you're discarded. This is mercy. This is love. This is all we deserve and more than most receive. The cold has reached my left temple now. I can feel it creeping across my scalp, threading through my hair. Soon it will cover my brain, and I wonder if my thoughts will become cold too, if I'll finally stop feeling the exhaustion and the despair and just exist as pure function. Maybe that's what the warp touch does in the end. Maybe it's not corruption or damnation, but a different kind of service, a transformation that makes us better suited for the roles we're forced to play. Maybe I'm becoming the perfect Navy rating, emotionless, tireless, incapable of questioning or rebelling, just performing my function until the ship has no more use for me. Or maybe I'm just trying to find meaning in something meaningless, trying to convince myself that this spreading death has purpose, that my slow transformation serves some higher goal. Maybe it's just another way the galaxy kills people, and I'm rationalizing to maintain sanity in the face of inevitable dissolution. I don't know. I can't know. The answers exist in places I don't have access to, held by people whose decisions determine my fate without my input. What I do know is this: tomorrow I'll wake at 0600 ship time. I'll use the communal latrines and eat my meal bar and report to my duty stations. I'll check gauges and clean filters and perform rituals and supervise my sections and train new personnel and write reports that no one will read. I'll do this every day for as long as I'm capable, because that's what I am now, what 17 years aboard the righteous deliverance has made me. I'm a component in a vast machine, and the machine requires my service, and so I serve. This is what it's really like on a warship. This is the truth behind the propaganda. This is the life you're volunteering for when you join the Imperial Navy, though they'll never tell you in the recruitment centers. You become part of the ship, and the ship becomes part of you, and the boundary between the two dissolves until you can't remember what it was like to be separate, to be individual, to be human in any sense beyond the biological. You serve until you can't, and then you're replaced, and the ship sails on, eternal and indifferent, carrying its cargo of broken souls toward battles you won't understand for causes you can't question. The Emperor protects, the machine endures, and I continue. Because continuing is all I have left.